So we cannot compete with Google. So I discussed with my co-founder and with my team. So then we transferred emotional AI to mental health AI and robotics.
So our belief is precision movement. So we selected the explorer, the new market in the global. We find the new way in the fitness gym or clinic in the global, but it's the different way of our company.
Because that failure influenced almost every decision that I made thereafter. VC, or a good investor, will support you through that failure, provided, as you reference, you are honest with yourself.
We had a big fight. However, but I was protecting our LP's interest, and I want to continue and try to make money for the financial. So it's both right justice.
We try so hard in-house. So even the failure may be a situation for the main business, but there might be some opportunity is in their organization. And if you can focusing on these, the potentials, then you might be able to thrive again. So that's something I learned about failure at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, so many people are, Yoko-san, thank you so much. So many people had to stay office, but I believe they are you guys are made a plan and came to here earlier, so appreciate. So the reason why I'm hosting this mini talk event today. So just 3 days ago, I was asked by Taku, the managing director of CIC, hey, Kaori, we have slot. So you want to do it? Yes. And then I got this opportunity. Anyway, so today's concept is as a startup founder, what can I say, to encouraging startup ecosystem in Japan. So we have to be tough. We have to be a resilience. Many difficult things, but we have to pivot or changing or flexible, right? So that we can learn from two AI startup founders. Tell us about your something experience, what you learned from a failure experience or difficult experience, and how did you change or pivoted. This is a concept. And funny thing, so recently I tried to watch Super Mario Brothers 2, 80s, because Mario, right? So he is dying a lot, but he doesn't give up. Mario's mission is saving Princess Peach, right? And then what can I say, go to fight and then beat boss. It's Koopa. And then finally Mario beat the boss. But okay, finally I can date with Princess Peachy, but she is not Princess Peachy. It's a mushroom. But he doesn't give up. A lot. I think this is kind of a startup founder's story. Of course, he's a solo. Anyway, sorry, I talked too much. I am Kaori Rei, a founder of a podcast, AI Founders Mindset. Today, we achieved 43K subscribers. So please subscribe us, and then here there are many investors and founders I already interviewed and I will interview. Okay, so from such, tell us about your introduction. Okay, you have my.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Sachiko Kamiyama at the Shosabi. Shosabi means the beautiful movement. So do you have the back pain? Who have the back pain? Okay, yeah, do you have the confidence of your posture? Yeah, you think it's a not important thing. That was big mistake. The posture and movement is one of the key elements to spend a great wellness life. It related not only the daily life, back pain, but also the wellness in the old age. So that's why we are revolutionizing healthcare with the bodily awareness technology that enable precision movement and improve the daily life. So our first target is the clinic and fitness gym in the global, not Japan. That is our business.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kaoli. Thank you for your invitation. Hi, friends. I'm Mei Shu. I'm an AI scientist from the University of Tokyo. At the same time, I'm the co-founder of SEMO. Actually, our core technology is based on emotional AI. Means AI can understand humans' emotions and it can interpret your emotions and also imitate your emotions. Like the movie Her, I know all of us know the movie, right? Currently, yeah. So currently our target customers are coming from mental health industries or robotics. Yeah, that's my brief introduction. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I found Meishu at the Ilia's event, Tokyo AI, and it was Japanese. And you reached out via LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about your story. What you learned from a failure experience or pivoting experience. Okay, from Meishu.
Okay. So for me, although I'm a scientist, but I always have a dream to make a product to help others, to impact the world, to give some positive impact to this world. Because sometimes only in the research field, only the researchers know your work, right? But if you transfer the research to a real product, then a lot of people from this world, they can get benefits. That's why I want to transfer my research to a real product. However, last year, I found my team, me and my co-founder Bai Lang. He's also here today. So at the beginning time, we are thinking we should use our emotional AI into different fields. There are many fields we can use, like educational stuff, like AI can understand whether you have frustration emotions during learning. So the product can automatically to change the learning difficulty levels, right? Yeah, that's one field. And also in cars or in mental health, everywhere we need emotional AI. So because all of us, we are coming from Todai, actually, last year. So we are thinking, we really need a product to help us to learn better. So that's why we built our first product, which is called Lyra. So it can help you to better learn YouTube videos. So like give you automatic transcript, or you can ask why, have very deep understanding of the learning content, actually. So, but however, when we found this team and during building the product, we found that the market is so competitive. So we cannot compete with Google. Actually, Google just launched their very similar product. Because they are a huge, giant company, we are very hard to compete with giant companies. So that's why I'm thinking, we should consider about this. So we should consider about our strengths, analyze the market, and analyze the users, and to reanalyze what we should do. So then, after 3 months, so I'm I was so struggling actually. So because I cannot see the educational AI product very bright future. So I discussed with my co-founder and with my team. So I researched a lot actually to analyze the market needs again. So then we transferred emotional AI to mental health AI and robotics also. Yeah, that's my, it's very tough because our team members somehow doesn't know what I'm thinking. So, but after around 1 month discussion, so I persuade our team members to transfer our direction. So luckily we launched our mental health AI application in Japanese market now called Samo. You can experience it. Yeah. So that's my story of when I meet Filia.
Yeah, from a previous product you guys already built, but you found there are many competitors. That's why, sorry, bye-bye. Yeah, I can imagine it was so hard because the product is kind of your baby, right?
Yeah, our baby. So me and my team members' baby. Yeah. So, but I think it's a still very valuable procedure you meet Phyllis. So it's a kind of pain, but you will get some, you will expand your cognition during the procedure. Actually, you learn faster. So in failure process.
Thank you. And then you convinced your team member, sorry, we have to pivot. And then they understood, and then they are still in your team?
Yeah, of course. Nice. Yeah, because I think when I found our team, we have the same mission to help the world, to transfer our technology to influence people. So our mission is always the same. So it's not so hard to persuade my team members.
Thank you. Okay, Sachi, so your turn. Let's talk about, please share about your story.
Okay, my story is pivoting and spring out of the Mitsubishi Chemical Group. Okay,
Yeah, you used to work at such a big corporate in a decade.
Yet
Yeah,
a long
amazing.
decade. Yeah, so I work as a scientist and some of the marketing and related なんだろう経営計画 the management of the company. During that, I always research about the healthcare field. So we developed the new technology for a solution for something to keep healthy using the motion. It's a very related presentation in the company health. So in March of the 2022, do you remember the 2022? 2020. Yeah, COVID-19. So before that, we planned we already done the great POC in the corporate health, corporate wellness, but nobody came the company. Yeah, everything the finish. So we have to the two different paths. One is the direct consumer. It is easier because everyone wants to be active at the home. But I believe the precision movement is most important things for us. So using the video, it is difficult to achieve the precision movement. I know that. So the different path is the movement is important. Such kind of things know the person who the doctor or personal trainer or the 理学療法士, such a kind of the predictioner. Yeah. So we try to explore that kind of the marketplace. So which is the right way we think about it? So our belief is precision movement. So we selected the explorer, the new market in the global. That is the big rough road. That is the starting of the big rough road. We find the new way in the fitness gym or clinic in the global, but it's the different way of our company. So after COVID-19, every year I needed some escalation elevator pitch to get fund from the Mitsubishi. And after that, we decided to spring out from the Mitsubishi. But we have to transfer our asset from the Mitsubishi. That is the rare case in Japan. So we have to make some new type of the contract and a new way of the thinking of all of our company. That was...
Yeah, I see. So you decided to quit your big company job and then start your own company to bring to the original idea, right? It's amazing. So, and then she's amazing. She did real elevator pitch. So, if I remember correctly, so Semo AI, so you guys have software, but not only like selling software, you guys are making revenue from the data, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
This is amazing.
Yeah. So because once we want to build our Samo AI, we need quite professional psychology stuff, psychology information. Actually, so in China, a lot of people, they know us, they know our team, so they know we are quite professional in emotional AI and psychology. So some of the team, they are lacking of psychology data, so they buy our data.
See, it's great because of we already have revenue. If we tell to investor, they can, oh, okay, this company is great. It's great factor. Good job.
Yeah, we have quite flexible business model. Yeah.
Thank you. How about Sachi?
Yes, we did. Easily measuring the right movement is very difficult and the new things. So our data is very valuable for everyone. So we can make the AI agent based on the data.
See, thank you. And if I remember correctly, your company, Shosabi, is encouraged by Dubai people, correct?
Yeah.
This is great news. You can tell.
Yeah. We already the traction in the Dubai and the UK. So the Dubai has a great the country has a great motivation to people that getting the healthy. So we have the great chance to traction in the Dubai and the Middle East and the great fitness, the number one fitness gym in UK.
I see. And both two like fitness gym company are kind of wealthy people, the fitness club, right?
Yeah, wealthy. Yeah, yes, wealthy. But it means the precision, the fitness gym. It means the practitioner want to make people the real health.
See, thank you so much. Yeah, so these two company has software utilized AI, but the strength is you guys can sell data. It's amazing. Two ways can make money. Thank you so much. So, okay, Q&A session. Do you have any questions?
Hello, much better. Thank you so much for your very inspiring talk. I am a founder for an AI company, a startup here in Japan, and we're currently, we have customers from all over the world, right? But we're currently trying to obtain customers in Japan. And we're in the process with a few of them. And I would like to ask you, what is the best way to go about courting them? As in, as you know, it is very difficult to court customers in the rest of the world versus compared to Japan. And so I have experience already selling to Japanese companies in other before I created this startup, but it was a more like a slower process, right? And so I want to know how do you balance the speed of a startup versus trying to court Japanese customers? This is a question for both of you guys, if I may. It's B2B. Thank you for the clarification. Very important.
Unfortunately, we gave up getting the Japanese company because I know the Japanese decision-making time.
Okay. Thank you. And what about you, Monsieur?
So for me, actually, my Japanese is quite bad. So, but my co-founder who can speak quite good Japanese and always he can communicate with our Japanese potential clients. But however, I have some business development experience in China, so we can share about it.
Oh, yeah.
Somehow you can educate your potential customer. So if a person who has strong motivate to help their company to win in the market, so you should tell him, your competitors, they're not sleeping. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, to help them to win in the market. So once you can educate them really well, you can be great partners together.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have the same question, but going the other way from Japan to global, what is your go-to-market strategy? So what sales and marketing tactics are working for you so far?
Yeah, it's a very great question, actually. So we all know. So for to-B market, the US is always the best, right? So the revenue is so high. And China is also another good opportunity to come in, and also Japan. So all of them, they have different advantage and disadvantages. So it really depends what your business is. So for us, actually, we are actively cooperate with Chinese robotic companies now, and some cooperators in mental health field in Japan. So it's quite different for to-B cooperation. Yeah, of course, we want to be a global company. So.
For me, I tried the US, UK, and the Middle East at the same time. But the US was too complicated. So we think first the simple and government focus to healthcare. So we need the data. So we selected the Middle East. But I want to go the UK. I want to go the US. So the directly Middle East to UK, US is very difficult. So I try to find the UK because the Middle East and the UK is very related company, especially economic. So I chose the UK and I got it, and fortunately I got I was selected the Alchemist in the US, the accelerator, so we have the chance and the village to build in the relation in the US. So the step by step.
I was just wondering, have any of you used government services like Jetro or any other services through the government, and has it worked or not?
Good question.
Please. Okay. So the Jutro is the great a lot of the program. So the Alchemist is one of the program of the Jutro, and the Jutro has a lot of the different countries program. I use that.
For me, not yet. but plan to do it. Because in AI salon community, so Jetro is always a supporter, I guess.
Sachiko, we both went through the Alchemist Japan Class 1 Accelerator Program, which is supported by Jetro. And recently there are many accelerator programs in Japan. There's Ansler and Techstars, Global 500, Plug and Play, a couple others that I can never remember the names of. Could you share what are the advantages of going through an accelerator program and how did it help you?
So the three things, I think. One is getting the great friend. Yeah, that is the most important answer, I think. Sometimes my friend, the cohort member, try to get fund for me. So sometimes they introduced our company. And the second is the knowing the American, the very tough market and the fundraising situation. Normally Japanese people, the American is more advanced and getting fund easier or something, but it's totally different. I know that. And the third is I know that a lot of people in the expertise, not only the US, but also the global. And the fourth is the name value of the Alchemist.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yes. Okay, panel 2. Okay, so if you have a question to Sachi and Menshu, please exchange LinkedIn. They are so great, like people who want to help. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Sachi. Okay, panel 2. So we need to have investors' perspective. Not only startup founders talk, we need to money so that we need to get investors' opinion. So please come. Really? Thank you so much. Yeah, so, okay, let's get started. Okay, so these three amazing investors are from my community. Just I got the opportunity to have this event on Monday from Taksan. Thank you, Taksan. And then, okay, Monday morning, okay, who I want to invite. And then I sent a message to three of investors, and they said, yes, thank you so much, as always. Okay, so please introduce yourself. What do you do in Tokyo? Okay, from Ken-san.
Hi, my name is Ken Yasunaga. I'm the founder and the managing partner at Global Hands-On VC. This is a VC fund that invests in the Japanese technology startups and help them going global, established by 2 Japanese and 3 Americans. Now, the character of our team is most of the guys come from the startup background. So either a serial entrepreneur or be some C-level person for the some startup companies.
And I have a fun fact of Ken. So Ken has cute T-shirts, Ultraman's enemy. What? Do you remember?
Actually, not today. Not today, but the last time I saw her, I was wearing the Shoka, the Kamen Riders. So I am telling them, you know, I'm the member of the Shoka before. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Barry. I've met many of you, I think, before. So I'm not going to call us a VC. We are an investor, though, because we invest from our balance sheet. Value Create is my company. I'm also EIR with Techstars and run a program actually with Jetro called Food Frontiers for growth stage Japanese companies. But I think my context to be here today is actually as a founder. So I'm a 3-time founder with one fabulous failure behind me. And I often describe the process of success as being learning from 1,000 micro failures. My favorite quote about entrepreneurship is actually from a novel by Douglas Adams. And Douglas Adams wrote it's the third book of a trilogy of 4, weirdly. He wrote in Life, the Universe, and Everything, he wrote, there's an art to flying, or rather a knack. And the knack lies in learning how to throw yourself at the ground and miss. And that's what entrepreneurship was like for me. It was a series of falling, and missing the ground. I often say to entrepreneurs, as an investor, my value is so you don't make the mistakes that I made. And we can try to somewhat de-risk your journey as an entrepreneur. So I'm happy to talk about investing. I've made lots of failed investments too. But I'm happy to talk about that. But mostly I like to talk about my experience as a one-time failed and then 2 exited founder.
Thank you, Barry. So thanks to Yuki Shirato, we met at the event in January, right? Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, Takumi. Actually, we are meeting like 3 times a week at the some event, always. And the last Friday, we talked a lot, deeply.
Yeah, we talked deeply. So I'm Takumi Shigami. I'm a venture capitalist at Bonds Investment Group, which is early stage VC fund. We try to invest in company which can sustain for like 2 decades. Well, originally ESG seemed fund, but we pivoted. But anyway, I think I'm here today that because like I'm not experienced you guys, but I've worked in the States, in Europe, and tried to provide like a kind of different aspects of how to fail and how to revive from like failing. Because failure itself is not the issue, but like if you fail correctly, you can get support from the investor again. But if you like fail like how to say selfishly or like too big, then there's no chance that you can obtain later. And there's some differences between the US and the Europe and Japanese kind of like market. So we'd like to discuss about it a bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then, so I know your fun fact, you are wearing something related to Switzerland, correct? Today, cute socks, like a Switzerland flower. Okay, Edelweiss. Yeah, Edelweiss. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about your failure story or the startup founders who failure. And you saw like this. So maybe from Barry, you want to?
Okay, yeah. So actually, my failure story is fairly simple. I had a .com from 1997 to 2001, and in 2001, it literally failed in a very, very big way. And I was, I think, what was I? Maybe 27, 28 at the time. And for me, I thought that I had failed as a person. That not that my company had failed, but personally that I was a failure. My picture was on the front of the newspaper saying 400 jobs to go, failure of, I was associated with a telecoms company. I only had 50 people working with me, not 400. And I found myself to be absolutely unemployable and depressed as a result of this. And one of the first things I say to any founder is that, something that you do that fails does not mean that you are a failure. Does not mean that you have failed. And there's a great book which I'll talk about towards the end, where one of the lines in the book is just because you feel like beep doesn't mean you are beep. So I'm sorry, blanking it just in case we're being broadcast. But just because you feel like shit doesn't mean you are shit. And learning that lesson was really, really important for me because that failure influenced almost every decision that I made thereafter. And often I found myself in a position of analysis or analysis paralysis, unable to make decisions because I would feel, well, what happens if this results in failure again for me? You actually have to take a bold step, and you have to surround yourself with people who can support you through that failure. And a good VC or a good investor will support you through that failure, provided, as you reference, you are honest with yourself and you are honest with them at all times. You can get through these problems.
At that time, did you have something like mental problem? What do you think?
I constantly had mental problems. So I started 3 startups. Of course I've got mental problems. Yeah. No, I found myself, I took a lot of psychotherapy after that. That's something that I'm proud of, and something that I would recommend that anybody does, is find themselves a good counselor, a career coach, and a mentor. They're often 3 separate roles. But for sure, yeah, I mean, you go through, if you feel hated, you're going to have mental problems. If you feel that you've lost other people's money, you're going to have mental problems. And I would say it's a sign of a very good founder, a responsible founder. We don't want them to feel bad, but if they really persist and try again to recover some value for their investors, that's a good founder.
Thank you.
It's going to be a long story, but I try to make it short. But I failed when I was doing my previous job was the managing partner at the just Japanese government fund. But before that, I was managing our own fund. It was established by my colleague at the Japanese trading company. And we decided to spin out and create some new fund. And we were in Japan and invested in technology startups. However, one of the key LPs and also one of our one of the investor in our GP company. He originally invested because of my colleague. There's a colleague and who is who's leading positions, but unfortunately, this person has left the company, left our firm, and go back to the original company. Yeah. So then this investor get angry, and okay, I don't want to support you anymore. Your investment portfolio sucks, and I don't want to get the money out. But legally, it's very hard to get the money out. So he tried to threaten me, and also try to communicate with other LPs. This fund have to be shut down. But at the same time, he started to say he want to manage by himself. So there's lots of really nasty communications. But finally, I decided to leave the firm. And try to make some, especially since the investment period was over, I let this guy to manage the current portfolio as much as they can. So I've done, 20, 30 page per company. Hitsugisho it's a paper that you're gonna hand it over everything, and then I decided to left. But the thing I learned is, we had a big fight. However, he has a own justice. He wanted to support my colleagues. He was so proud of, supporting this. But I was protecting our LP's interest, and I want to continue and try to make money for the financial. So it's both right justice. So there's no right or wrong in each justice. Each perspective is different. So that's all. So I think I think at the end of the day, we also had real mental issues, and we really struggle and struggle with the communications. But I learned that was a big lesson that I learned. And it's a precious time in my life.
How did you overcome from this difficult time?
It's a it's a communication issue. I have to, talk to each of the LP. Is there anything? This is my recommendation. Is there anything that you can? Any objections? And I try to communicate. I like to make sure that this guy will do the right job for the remaining firm. So that kind of communication was the important. So I think I'm sure they are not very happy, but I did what I can do at that point in my best. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's aggregating business of the e-commerce. Aggregating the e-commerce business is like P fund of the e-commerce, let's say. And that was probably some of you know, like that was kind of like the itch thing in 2020. So after COVID, like people stay at home and the interest rate was low. So it was like amazing to starting business like this. And I was part of like M&A manager and operational manager at the farm, one of the farm. And since the US interest rate rose like drastically, the business model didn't become like sustainable. The interest payment was too much for many of their companies. So the biggest one called Serasio got fell like last year. And so like my farm also had like huge issue back in them. And unfortunately, actually many of the departments were closed and things. But like at the same time, since we are operating the businesses, our main businesses were like failing, but we created so many different tools to kind of like try to strive even in the bad condition, such as the tool to setting for different geography or like the integrating from like Amazon to Walmart and the different kind of channels. And although like it got like size got shrink, two YC company came out of this farm because we had we tried so hard in-house. So even the failure may be a situation for the main business, but there might be some opportunity is in their like organization. And if you can focusing on like these, how to say, the potentials, then you might be able to like thrive again. So that's like something I learned about failure that time. Yeah.
See, thank you so much. Yeah, like these, can I say, persistence and perseverance is key. I see. Okay, so let's do question time. So I believe there are many founders who are afraid to start something or like failure. So you guys can give advice. So please ask.
For this, this is one of my partners saying, he said, I have never failed. So arrogant. But he said,
Japanese?
He's a Japanese. But actually, what his comment is, I never failed because I try to succeed. I try to learn the lesson from that failure, and I try to pivot or do some new things, and go on until he succeed. So of course, so my story sounds like a failure, but I think that's a success. That helped me grow. So in the case of business, that shit happens, and your company has to go bankrupt or some selling, do the fire sale. But in your life, that's a big success. So I don't think talking about failure or to avoid failure is meaningless. So I think that's my experience is a really bad experience, but I think it's my best moment.
Actually, I'm quite agree with your the person you said who is arrogant. I'm that kind of person, actually. I never failed, actually. So I think failure is a kind of other people's perspective. But from your inner heart, you always grow. So you always expand your cognition. It's a good point, I think. Yeah, that's I want to discuss it.
Yes, I wanted to ask, what is a good way to fail, and what is kind of the way to fail that you don't want, that restricts your chances in the future? And when should you admit to yourself that you failed, and how can it help you in the future once you've admitted that you failed? Yes, just a topic to maybe elaborate on.
I think you need to be honest with yourself, and I think if you feel that you're in a position that you're in the process of failing, you need to really ask others around you. We really need to seek counsel from people that you trust or mentors that you find. I was in a situation maybe about 6 years ago where my board of directors thought I was failing. And I knew that I wouldn't fail. But every day I still took counsel. I took legal counsel because I was at risk of running a company that was at the potential of becoming insolvent. So I took legal counsel every day. I explained to my lawyer every day, this is why I'm not laying off everybody today, because I feel that this piece is going to happen. So you have to be very honest with yourself, and you have to be very open with people. Don't let pride stand in the way. Be humble. Let show some vulnerability, and people will help you. So I would say sometimes it's very hard to see something in yourself, and it's often very hard to recognize patterns in yourself. And patterns are my middle name, and not recognize them. I remember, I think it was 2006. I woke up on a Monday and needed $150,000 by the Friday, right? I was like, what the hell? And I got the $150,000. And for years later, I said, I'm never going to let that happen again. Of course, then, that incident, I needed $1 million by the Friday, 10 years later. That's pattern recognition, but you kind of know what to do. So if you can't see the patterns in yourself, seek counsel on others. Ask people what your weaknesses are, but not in a difficult way, like how they can help you, how they can complement you. That's certainly one perspective that I would have on recognizing failure. And that in itself will stand to you. That's most likely going to end in failure aversion or failure avoidance. So in which case, it's a good kind of failure. It's recognizing the fact that you are at risk and then helping or seeking help to get through that process. That's my perspective.
I think add to that, for the business perspective, try to fail small. Like you can, what I've noticed since I came back to Japan is that many of the Japanese entrepreneurs want to make everything perfect and then launch the service or start selling. But if it's not really fitting to the market, it's too late. So it's better to always getting constant advices or constant reaction, observing constant reaction from the market and try to improve it. And another thing that they really agree on that, don't be prideful. The most successful people I met, billionaires I have met, they listen so much. They try to get all information, even from high school students. So maybe something I understand that your business or your service is like your puppy or your baby. You really love them, but you need to be critical because you have audience to sell your service or product. So just please be open-minded, and then you can kind of understand if you're going toward to the failing direction or not, quite clearly, I will say.
Thank you. It's not really a question, just I wanted to kind of add to that. So Takumi and Barry, I think you both had very good points and really pertinent points. So Takumi, you said don't be afraid to fail, but try to fail small, sort of in iterative ways. And Barry, you talked about the importance of getting counseling and maybe having a support network. I've started now 4 companies in Japan and had successes and failures. One pretty drastic failure, and that led to the end of my first marriage and the loss of a lot of friendships, and technically was homeless for a while, living in incubators, that kind of stuff. Through that, I realized how important it is to not try to carry all of the burden yourself. Founders don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be like the perfect leader of the company all the time. So you can ask for help. Through that experience, I've become a board member on the Tell Lifeline, which is a suicide prevention hotline here in Japan, and runs a series of clinics for those struggling with issues like depression. And I would just like to encourage everybody to reach out if you feel like you need a bit of help. There are a lot of ways to get counseling and sort of share the burden. Being a founder is really hard, right? It's really hard. But don't try to carry all the burden yourself. Get support, talk to mentors, make use of these services that allow you to kind of share the burden and then get back to work with more of a clearer heart.
So much.
Add to that, probably you better to communicate with the investors, because if you have frequent communication with the existing investors, they try to find the way to support you, and it's always better to understand the situation rather than suddenly getting bad news. So they can be a great helper, but also it's kind of like better way of the communication with existing investors.
Thank you so much for watching our event report today. We really love to host this mini talk event. So if you are having a venue, if you have a company, if you have some idea, please reach out via LinkedIn.